All right, welcome everyone to the Gateway API meeting for April 10th, 2023. Thanks to everyone who showed up. As always, we are looking to record who's attending just so we get a better picture of what meeting times work makes sense. We are trying to experiment with different meeting times coming soon, just maybe more Europe-friendly meeting times, because we know there are people that are interested that just can't make this meeting time. So if we have an accurate record of who's attending these different meetings, it's very helpful. With that said, and this is a standard Kubernetes code of conduct meeting, that abides by the code of conduct. So be nice to everyone. Nothing too crazy here, but this meeting is open to everyone. Please feel like you're welcome. This agenda is open. It should be in the meeting invite or any other way you got here. If someone is willing, if they can drop a link in chat too, that might be helpful. But as always, don't hesitate to add something to the agenda or mention it in chat, and we'll try and get to it in today's meeting. With that, I think I see maybe one or two new names. If anyone is interested, feel free to take this opportunity to introduce yourself. We always like to see people who are new to the group who and what interests them in Gateway API. All right, no worries. I'll keep on going. Okay, so the very first thing on the agenda is the 0.7 release. We are making good progress towards this. I added a few links to the agenda. I think it was Shane went through and cleaned up the milestones. So the very last thing left is this API review PR. For those of you who have not been through a release process with Gateway API before, the way that we do releases is we start with agreement among maintainers that we're ready to start the API review process. And then we reach out to SIG Network API reviewers that right now is Tim Hawken and Cal. And both of them will run through our code base, look at changes. Specifically, this is looking at changes to our API and our validation. We've got some feedback already on this. And then once they're happy with our the state of our API, we will go ahead and push out a release candidate that allows implementations to test out the release. And if all goes well, we should have a final 0.7 release sometime soon. But I think Shane added a very helpful approximate timeline for how we see this working. This is based on previous experience. This makes it look like our final release for 0.7.0 may be May 2. These are very, very approximate timelines, though. Everything in open source is based on volunteers that don't have any firm time commitments here. So these are approximations based on prior experience, and that's it. So we'll do our best, but we cannot guarantee any of these dates. All right. Any questions on that before I keep on going? Cool. I'll keep on moving then. Next, I want to highlight that we have a PR that includes changelog, which is really every PR that had a release note between 0.6 and 0.7. If you're interested in what we've changed in the past 5 months or so, that could be a useful reference. This, as I linked to, is the API review PR itself. This is where we're getting feedback from Tim and Cal. There are a few things in here that we'll try and translate into issues. But before that happens, if you see something that you want to take on and try and help out with, for example, this one seems like an easy one. Instead of field.forbidden, we should be using field.duplicate. If you're looking for a way to contribute to the project and speed up the 0.7 release, taking on any of these little comments and help and sending a PR to get a fix in would be very helpful. Okay, and then very, very much final on the 0.7 release topic. I'll mention that this is the review slides kind of overview that we presented to Tim and Cal just last week. It was just a very high level overview of what we changed in v07.0. If you have maybe missed some things or not seen everything that's happened in the past few months, I think these slides may be a useful reference point, very similar to the change log, to understand the major themes that are changing in this release. At a high level, path redirects and rewrites are going to standard channel. Response header modifier is also going to standard channel. Direct policy attachment is a net new concept for policy attachment. Thanks to Nick for that one. Multi-cluster services and gateway API have been kind of formalized into a concept of how they interact with each other. And then Shane has really been working on conformance profiles, which is going to be really, really great set of improvements for our conformance tests. So those are the main high-level things that are happening in this release, but that is just kind of the high-level overview, and there's, of course, more in it than that. Okay, that's all I've got. They did provide some high-level feedback just in the discussion itself. There were some concerns about the policy attachment user experience. A suggestion that maybe we should work with API machinery or someone to create a concept where a resource could implement or inherit from another resource. So you could say, hey, this policy is a type of gateway policy, or maybe introduce some kind of intermediate resource so that it's very easy for users to do kubectl get gateway policy bindings. I don't know. And you could say, okay, this policy has been applied to this resource by this controller as a rough example. So some ideas there to try and smooth out the UX. Then there were some small kind of non-blocking concerns about the lack of precision in the current MCS gap. And then just a suggestion or recommendation to share just an overall update at the broader SIG Network meeting sometime soon. Yeah, I've been talking a lot, so I know others were at this meeting. Anything that I might have missed that is worth discussing here? Cool. All right. Well, I'll just keep on going then. All right. So next up, meeting times. The next meeting is canceled. It's going to be KubeCon. So for anyone that can make it, we hope to see you there in person. And if not, we'll see you the following week. But next week, Gateway and Gamma meetings are canceled. Then the next up is we're considering one of the following EU-friendly times for a meeting post-KubeCon. First, April 26th, that's a Wednesday at 9 a.m. Pacific, or second, May 2 at 9 a.m. Pacific. That's a Tuesday. I don't have a very strong preference here. We may just flip a coin and pick one of these dates. But if one of them is easier for you to attend, or one is just you have a conflict with one, please let us know in the next, I don't know, 24 hours. Otherwise, we'll just pick one and go with it. All right. So with that, I can hand it off. I think, Grant, you're on this call and you had some updates about session persistence.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, I wanted to keep pushing on the session persistence API. We had started out with the GEP. I can link that here. So we have something preliminary. We have a GEP that's in the repo that is sort of preliminary. We've got a couple of open items, but I sort of just started to write down some. I asked in the channel, like, what's the next step we should take on this? Robbie mentioned, like, hey, maybe it'd be good if we wrote down configuration that's common between a lot of the implementations and proxies and data planes, whatever we want to call them. So I started that in this document. I'll admit I'm kind of wandering a little bit because this is my first sort of API field. So I could probably use a little bit of direction, maybe help with like what questions we want to answer. I know we have some in the document or in the GEP that we want to answer, but I was, I guess, curious to bring this up for maybe review. If you guys think this should be in a GEP, or if you can help me reduce the information down in this Google Doc, and then we can get it back into a GEP, that would be awesome.
Oh, this is really awesome. I have not had the time to look at this in advance, but this looks like a really useful doc. Am I reading this correctly that the kind of common ground here is really just cookie-based session persistence here, and the header-based is unique to Envoy?
I think there's maybe one or two. So I made two tables. The first table is what I called proxies, but I've recently renamed them to data planes. And then the second table right below this is implementations. So I could probably use some help with if that makes sense, but I kind of broke it out into two sections because things are configured. I guess the main reason was that implementations can sometimes miss configurations that um, that data planes have, and then also I discovered something kind of interesting where Contour like got around Istio's lack of native support for cookie attributes and by using Lua scripts. So it kind of just helps, I guess these two tables help enumerate sort of the possibilities for configuration.
But I think it is reasonable, safe to say that using cookies for percent of sessions has been the way to do things in the last 20 years, way before Kubernetes, and it's most universally supported way.
Yeah, I would agree that it's kind of the lowest hanging fruit at this point, where that's below. I started on sort of an analysis of cookie. You know, what are some of the common fields? What do I think Gateway API should configure? So yeah, maybe that's the best thing to start with here, since it just seems like the easiest thing to take on.
And we can extend it later. I mean, it's not, we are not, if we start with cookies and we find that headers become very common, we can extend the API easily. I mean, but getting the broadest adoption will probably be based on the cookie approach.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great reference. I know what you had done already earlier with this GEP has already been used as a reference for future GEPs, and I think this is a great reference point again for future GEPs of just having again this kind of high level. These are major data plane implementations, what they support, and then also for bonus points the active implementations of the API today and what they support. So yeah, this is really great and really helpful. At present, I'm not seeing any reason, I feel like this verbatim is probably useful to get into the GEP because the GEP is still a provisional state. And I think from there, kind of the natural conclusion here is really what is the common ground, the set of configuration that most implementations are going to be able to support. And that seems pretty clearly to be cookie-based affinity at this point, or session persistence. But for now, just having what you have in this doc seems like a very good addition to the GEP from my perspective.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Looking at cookies and looking at the common configuration, I think one thing that I was trying to answer was and maybe I'm jumping too far ahead and you can tell me if this will come later, but when we think about the API structure of session persistence, like, I looked at Istio and they use this sort of consistent hash LB field. And they kind of they group the session persistence in what we've defined as session affinity, or, weak session persistence, or, whatever you want to call it, which is more like load balancing algorithms, or, base your affinity on a source IP. So I guess I was starting to think about like the API structure of, okay, well, maybe we could figure out how to configure cookies, but does it make sense we should try to answer in what fields the cookie should be configured under, whether it's a field that is specific to session persistence, or it's a field that also can do other consistent hashing, session affinity type features. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, I think that is the natural next step. My personal opinion here would be to, take this that I think is non-controversial. It's just kind of providing state of the world information and get this in. And then I think, yes, what you're really getting at is, what does this API look like? And at that point, I think we really need to explore a few alternatives. And that feels like something that we want to do after this is in, like kind of the next natural evolution of this CAP. I haven't thought about it enough to decide where, where we should limit this scope to. But I think that really is the next step here. Costin, you've got a hand.
Yeah, since I implemented it in Istio and I have a talk at KubeCon, I thought about it for a bit. I think it's useful to decouple the persistent session cookie-based and the real persistent session from load balancing choices, because they are slightly different, have different semantics, and a lot of people actually need this persistent session because it's a feature that has not been available before in Kubernetes and Istio. And I would point out that there is a Kubernetes API already to define this in service, where persistent session is defined as client-based, and kind of provide the same kind of characteristics that we have. So, and I was wondering if we should just implement the service as it is. I mean, to respect session affinity declared in service, or we can define it as an extension. But probably the extension is the right solution, given that will probably add additional stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's something I can look into. I guess my question is for this next step, which I guess I mean next PR update, next PR. Am I trying to is it a good idea to try to answer those questions yet? Or are you thinking we should kind of take what we have here, just get it into another PR, and then get that checked in, and then proceed with trying to design an API?
Yeah, I would say the latter, because this is a pretty big change in addition to the GAP, and I think it's non-controversial. So I would love to see this go in, and then I think the API changes, if we can limit that PR to just API changes, it will help make the review feel a little bit more manageable, because we're not reviewing the whole GAP, we're just reviewing the proposed API on top.
Okay.
The
Awesome.
one thing that I, just looking at this a little bit more closely, the one thing that would be really helpful to have is if you can approximate where this config lives. One of the things with other features, at least, is the granularity of config is actually a pretty important detail. If some of this config is tied to a service in one data plane, but others have it at a slightly higher level. And by service, I mean the equivalent of service in each of these concepts. If that's something that is somewhat straightforward to represent, or at least manageable, in deciding where this configuration lives.
Yeah, I definitely, I had that as an open question, and I just couldn't find the right vocabulary to use. It just seems like a very abstract thing to talk about, because I guess when you compare like gateway API, I guess my mindset's gateways, routes, and services, and I guess backends. And then when you try to put that on top of some of the existing implementations, it becomes kind of hard to talk about. But yeah, I think that would be an interesting thing to try to draw some common parallels with. So I can give it a shot.
Yeah, I know it's not trivial to make that mapping, so I would not consider it a blocker. It's just nice to have if you happen to already have some ideas.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Any other thoughts on this doc before I move on? All right, well, thanks, Grant. This is really good. All right, next up is, it's me again, KubeCon. Really simple update here. I think this came out in the Gamma meeting last week. Hopefully my memory's right, but there's an overall Gateway API update session on Wednesday morning. If any of the people here are going to be at KubeCon, there's been some interest in informally meeting up, and so an easy thing to do would just be to meet for lunch sometime after that session. So we can just organize in Slack, but just be on the lookout if you are there Wednesday morning. We would love to meet up. All right, now somebody added a lot of things to triage, so we'll try and work through as many as we can here, but I have not looked at any of these in advance, so we'll see how far we make it. If anyone has any more context on any of these, please don't hesitate to join in. Okay, so this one, replacing a prefix separate from the regex match. Yeah, I think this one is, I think we have, Shane, you may be able to pipe in on this one, but I know we've been trying to track and triage these kind of new bugs. I think this falls under the category of this would be cool to have, but we just don't have the time to do it. But, I don't think anyone's against, different kind of capabilities here if they're broadly supportable enough. But I don't think there's,
I would say unless
So-
anybody has anything else to say, we mark it, what I've been doing is marking them help and priority backlog with a note that just kind of says, we would definitely like somebody to help us, but we don't expect this will be something we'll really focus on until after GA.
Should we label them as help then? If should we just reserve help for things between now and GA?
I'm fine with that. My thinking is kind of, if somebody's only going to want to work on this one thing, we don't necessarily want to stop them from doing it. The idea is more to say, please make this the lowest priority, and unless it's your only priority, you know what I mean? That's kind of my thinking, but I'm okay with pulling back to help. Somebody can always ask and be like, hey, can I do this one?
Yeah, I think I'm just gonna remove help from this, just because I know me personally, when I see the help label, I feel some obligation to help review because I've kind of invited a new contributor to work on this, and in this case, I know like
Sounds good.
if it's backlog, I don't think I'll have a lot of time to devote to it.
Okay, then yeah, just we'd be welcome to somebody taking this on after GA.
Yeah.
And then pull it off to GA board, because we won't be
That works.
prioritizing it anytime soon.
No, I don't want to get into this. I'll just
Click
leave
above
it
it, yeah.
as
If you click above it on projects, you can drop it from the project.
Oh, look at you. All right, thanks. All right, next up is 1626. Attached routes spec does not clarify how to handle partially invalid states. We already need to change to attached routes because attached routes refers to, well, we had a condition previously that was attached. That condition does not exist anymore. So we can't really rename this field, but we should at least update the Go doc around it. And likely as doing that, we should provide some kind of guidance on this partially invalid state.
Good.
Say that again, Shane, cut out.
Ideally, maybe not necessarily, but ideally before GA would be good.
So we'll just throw this into backlog then.
Yeah, give it priority, important. I think important soon seems reasonable enough.
Okay, that's where it is. Okay,
Drop it in
on to the
the,
next one.
this is something we could do. Oh, sorry. It is
Oh, go
something we
ahead.
could potentially do in V080. I mean, it's actually, that's simple enough. I could say we could even do it in V071 if we do a patch
Yeah.
release, which right now. So maybe we just drop it in V071
Okay,
and actually put it in next in the status so people know that's one you can pick up right away.
sure. All right, 1629, race condition. I think we had talked about this one. This is a race condition when updating status. And there was some specific way, yeah, and Antoine has covered how to resolve this.
This is not ringing a bell for me right now.
Yeah, there was basically, you can do, we should have some kind of merge strategy, but we don't have a unique field in status. Maybe that is the thing. So right now, the problem with status on routes is that we're expecting multiple controllers to write the status, and there is a possibility that they could get into a race condition if they're both trying to write at the same time. And we do not have a merge key specified on that, is I think what this is. This feels reasonably important. Has anyone actually run into this? Anyone else other than the reporter of this issue? It may be that it's fairly uncommon for the same route to be implemented by multiple gateways and those gateways be different controllers.
Well, certainly if you're migrating between two gateway implementations,
Yeah.
then this can happen and you could get like clobbering potentially.
Yeah. This is one, it feels real. It does not feel quite as critical to me as some of the other ones. It does not feel like it needs to block anything, but I would be happy to see someone work on it.
We could make it a hopeful for V080.
Yeah, I feel like it's unlikely someone's going to take it on between now and 080, but I don't know. But if anyone volunteers, yeah, we can clear it out if it doesn't work.
Just for clarity, the issue here is that parents on HTTP route status is a list. So something would have to merge them or like merge the list, and how that's done is undefined. Is that?
Yeah, so basically if, for example, if you have, this should be fine because like, as John mentioned, you should just be able to retry and eventually reach a consistent state. But you can imagine a world where you have two gateway implementations that see a brand new TCP route in this example, and that TCP route is trying to reference both of their gateways separately, then both of those controllers may at the same time try to write to status parents, I forget what it is, like at index 0, basically. And that would just cause a conflict, right? They would both be trying to do the same thing. One would win and the other would fail because it was out of date.
They'd
So
both
they
be
won't
yelling for a while
irrevocably-
until they figured it out.
Yeah. So they won't like irrevocably clobber each other because we do have the still split by like controller name in the actual item itself. So like you won't like override and lose one. It's just one will hit the observed generation or whatever unexpected and have to retry. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, so this
Doesn't-
is definitely in the you know, like a kind of a nice to have category, but it is nice to have.
Makes sense.
I think the priority on it is good. You just might want to put a help wanted on it if somebody's interested in taking it. But actually, in retrospect, V080 might have been a little bit too much. Maybe we could just put it on V01 and see if we can make it for GA.
Yeah. I would agree
That
with
way,
that.
that way we don't put it in next. We put it in backlog because there are other things in next already that should get higher priority over it.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, this is unlikely to happen. I mean, it's great if it does, but
We'll see.
yeah.
You never know when the original author might just suddenly show up one day and be like, you know what, I'm ready to nail this now. So
Yeah, that's fair. Richard, I think you're on this call. I talked with you a little bit about this one. Richard, are you still around on the gRPC web?
Yes. So I think that this is like a really reasonable idea. It's sort of one of the first things that I was thinking of doing in a second pass after we have the basic gRPC functionality in. gRPC web is a different protocol from gRPC proper. And so there are a couple of different considerations here. Generally, what people do is they have a transcoder sitting at the front of their system. So at the API gateway, it's sort of a natural fit for something within the gateway resource. Two potential ideas. One Rob brought up is it could be a new protocol on the listener, could maybe also be a policy attached on the gateway. Not sure the best way to do this exactly yet, but I do think it's relatively large size scope of work to do, not as big as the initial gRPC route, maybe 50% the size. So yeah, I definitely, if you know, somebody's willing to drive this through, I'd be happy to help and advise.
Cool. Costin?
Yeah, we had a recent discussion on Istio about just enabling it by default. I mean, if the Envoy supports it, just turn it on, and because it's not a major security concern, it's you know, why not?
Does anyone use, support both in parallel on, say, the same port or the same gateway?
Yeah, it's a different content type, so it's if you enable it, it's not a problem. For example, there are implementations that just happen by default to enable both of them, like a new implementation of gRPC in Go.
Okay, and so in that case, you would have, potentially the same listener on the gateway and the same route definitions even, and they would apply to both gRPC web and the main gRPC protocol.
Yeah, it's negotiation at the content type level. So it's HTTP route. It's perfectly fine. It doesn't really matter. Just transcription must be enabled somewhere to translate from protobuf to text in some cases.
Okay. So that makes it sound like this is more of a switch, like just a support this protocol as well than anything else.
Yeah, also we need to support it with HTTP route because many implementations of gateways in particular where this feature would be enabled may not support gRPC route because it's not required and it's not something that, for example, Envoy out of the box is supporting or managed gateway. Managed gateway may not have native gRPC support, but will have HTTP support, HTTP route support.
In that case, you're saying that they would not be terminating the gRPC web protocol and immediately going to gRPC, but rather they would be using gRPC web in and gRPC web out.
Why not?
I just have never seen any cases of that before.
I think that's how Envoy works. I mean, you can, if you enable the gRPC web filter, it's going to terminate gRPC web with the browser, and then it's going to make a gRPC with the backend.
Right. That is the case that I'm familiar with. I was asking if there would be a scenario where you would get gRPC web in, and then you would also send gRPC web out to your backends.
I'm not aware of any of this.
Okay, good.
Okay, so it sounds like this is something that is relatively straightforward to add on after the fact. It is not something that needs to block gRPC route. It's just, maybe even somewhat orthogonal to gRPC route based on the idea that we would also want this kind of policy or config to apply to HTTP route, or while the gateway in front of that. So given that, I feel like the likelihood of this coming in before GA is pretty low. So I may just remove it from the board. Any concern about that?
Yeah, with a note that implementations may choose to implement to enable gRPC web by default, or through their own,
Yeah.
it's going to customize it.
Okay.
I'm in support of this can be afterwards.
Okay. All right, and then we're on to 1765 then.
I don't think in
Uh,
all the years that I've been doing Gateway API, I've ever seen us have this much time for triage.
Yeah, this is great. I guess it's the post feature freeze pre-KubeCon quiet, whatever that is. So take it. Costin, do you still mean to have your head? Okay, never mind. All right, this one I don't really understand. Make listener can expose more than one port. Oh, I got it. This is port ranges per listener. Costa and Shane, you both commented on this. Do either of you?
I'm having a Gandalf moment.
Okay, all right. It's not just me.
Yeah, it's a bit controversial because some implementations may not support it, and having it as an extension or vendor extension, whatever, is perfectly fine. But it's tricky with existing gateways.
Yeah. For
Not
historical
for-
context, when we went to beta, I think one of the bits of feedback from Tim, Cal, or both of them was that they really wanted to at least have a path towards multi-port listeners or all ports. And so we documented what that would look like. And it was basically just a port range and the port range could be 0 to 65, whatever. And that was acceptable as a future extension of the API, and we just have not prioritized it. So I think there is interest in it, even though, like Costa mentioned, like it's not something that can be supported in many cases. It is useful to have the capability in the API. Yeah, so I guess this is another one of those things that no one is going to get in the way of it, but it does not feel like it needs to get between us and GA.
I think it would be good to know a little bit. Well, I guess the why is kind of straightforward in retrospect.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And there's been a long-lived all ports kept in upstream Kubernetes on service, and the person working on that is no longer working on Kubernetes, and it just kind of fizzled out and said, well, maybe Gateway can solve this, and eventually we should, but it just probably won't be between now and GA.
Well, maybe we should go ahead and mark this one accordingly, give it a priority backlog instead of awaiting more evidence. Say,
Yeah.
we'll do it, but after GA.
I think, well, okay.
If you use the slash priority, it'll replace it, I think, for you.
Yeah, it's backlog, right?
Yeah, I think we're kind
And
of
I
just putting
don't,
anything that doesn't make it to GA and backlog for now, and then after GA, we can start going back through them again.
hopefully I got the right ones. Okay. And
I still haven't plugged in the actual triage thing yet. Oh, I didn't do what I
Yeah.
thought it would do. That might be because I haven't plugged in the actual triage plugin.
Yeah,
yet, so
no,
you
it will
just
add things,
manually
but I
remove
need to
those.
do the corresponding remove. And I think instead I am just going to cheat.
Yeah.
Um,
Ta-da.
okay. Magic. All right, on to the next one. 1799. Oh, yeah, GZIP. Any opinions on this one? Looks like Shane, you're the last one to comment.
Am I? Yeah, we talked about it and we were basically saying GEP. So I like somebody needs to actually say how this is going to happen. So at this point, I would kind of vote we got enough in GA. I would vote that this can be a post GA thing. We still do
Yep.
it, but accept it, but call it priority backlog and say we'll do it after GA.
Yep, that's fine. I all for that. I think even needs information is fine because we're basically saying we need a gap, and so sure.
Sure. Yep.
All right, 1812. John, this is yours. I don't know if you're still on the call. How policies should attach to a pod.
Isn't
I
it
guess
more
we can.
Gamma than Gateway?
Yeah, it feels like it. It's hard, you know. I think we just need more conversation here. I know that I feel like since the issue came from John, he can continue to drive this one forward. I'm not too worried about it getting stale. So I'm fine to just let this one sit. If anyone else feels differently, let me know. All right. 1861. Provide additional granularity in backend ref section. I want to say this was proposing the idea of, yeah, subsets, service subsets, which has been something that we've avoided pretty strongly in Kubernetes in general. I think this is just a conversation that we can probably close pretty soon. Damian, are you on this call? No. Anyone with a strong opinion on this one?
This came up briefly, I think, on the Gamma call, and it's something that like Istio supports and console supports today. So there's a kind of a question of like, is this something that would ever make its way into Gateway API? And like, if not, why not? And what's the recommended alternative? Which I think is just like creating additional services.
Yep. Yeah, I think if I understand the idea right now correctly, it's that services are pretty heavyweight because they include so many things. Gateway API is trying to take away a lot of that extra complexity from service and move it into Gateway API. I think, at least from my view of the world, this is, service is still meant to be the smallest piece of this puzzle without subsets, but services should hopefully become lighter weight or something. I don't know. Ideally, you wouldn't need, ideally, there would be some ways to optimize that, but it feels a little strange to add this concept in Gateway API when it really feels like it's a subset of service, and usually we exist above service, not below. I don't know.
We're gonna hide it in coming years.
Yeah.
I think it's basically a question for that point.
Yeah. Okay, I'll leave this one open and I'll come back to it to read it a little bit more thoroughly, but I know I've been in this conversation at least.
Having a Gandalf moment.
Yeah. 1870 is backend update guarantees. Dave, I don't know if you're on this call. No, I have not been involved in this conversation at all, and I don't know if anyone on this call has either. Does anyone want to volunteer to triage this at least? To figure out where it belongs? Is for anyone unfamiliar with the triage process, it is really just trying to determine what the next step of action is for Gateway API. Is this something that we should turn into a gap? Is this something that is really just a question about the existing API that we can close? I'm not sure.
Yeah, just take it, read it through, ask some questions, make a recommendation, that kind of thing. Just keep in mind that the tooling's not quite on yet. I think I'm going to try to get to that this week. So it's just kind of mess with things a little bit.
So from my perspective, one of the next steps is probably to define like a ready status at the route level, so that users are more confident of when a route is ready. So I think that's one of the pieces, and I know it's hard to do, but if the API proposes that, and we can see which implementations can want to desire to implement that, then that should make end users a little happier, because they're guaranteed that it's okay to start sending traffic, because it won't temporarily backhaul.
Now, as a tiny nitpick there, do you mean ready in the way Gateway defines it, or something closer to programmed, the status condition on Gateway?
Another level more than that. So ready in the sense that controller has sent the configuration to the proxy and proxy has act back. That's one way, which is an active act. The second is controller can health check or config check to make sure that that value is actually part of the data plane.
So this would be aligned with like gateway ready.
Yeah, but I think it was discussed and that status was removed and deprecated because at the gateway level, it's not. So it's more useful at the route level because the route ties the gateway to the backend. So it's kind of joins 3 lines together. So it joins the dots. So it's more useful there. At the gateway level, it's useful from has like the TLS configuration been programmed, but it can't guarantee anything more than that. But at the route level, you can guarantee that, hey, I have programmed a healthy backend.
Okay. And you think that is more implementable than the same condition on a gateway? Just because it's a subset of gateway, basically?
I think the from an implementation perspective, the level of difficulty is the same, but from a end user usefulness, the route status is more useful. As Brian says, this route is ready to receive traffic versus configuration has been applied.
Right. I mean, that makes sense. One of the things we've struggled with on the ready condition and gateway is just that it was unclear if anyone today could actually implement it. But obviously, if it's implementable, I agree, it's a huge win for users.
At the gateway,
John?
it also, sorry, I'll let somebody else talk.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry, I missed the first half of this conversation. But I was a bit confused because this issue actually doesn't have to do with ready. It's actually about changing a route, basically. Well, issue number one is, but that's a bit different. I guess I was only focusing on issue 2 because only issue 2 is very interesting to me. Were we talking only about 1 there with ready? Oh, sorry. Actually, I have these mixed up. My apologies. Only 1. Sorry, 1 does not have to do with ready, and it's actually more about the fact that changing a route should be 0 downtime. What status says doesn't matter because this is your clients on the public internet sending traffic to your site continuously, right? And they don't want to see downtime when you make a change to the route. So it's not really, status isn't relevant here.
But 2 is the one that applies more to a ready condition.
Honestly, even 2 isn't, because 2 is saying that if you want to have 0 downtime, you need to make sure that you don't apply a route too early. But the thing that you should be waiting for is not whether an HTTP route is ready, it's whether the backend is ready. So it's really like orthogonal. I mean, you could argue like, sure, set the HTTP route to not match any traffic, wait for that to be ready, and then change it to wait. But really what you want is the backend ready. And deployment or service or endpoints ready actually don't represent whether the backend is ready, because that's the intent, whether they should be ready. It's not whether the actual data plane is able to start serving those right away, right? So that's kind of a trickier problem.
Yeah, good point. Thank you.
Yeah, I would think like in 1, at least how we have solved this so far is in 1, we just make sure that is the case in our implementation. And I think everyone should do that. Otherwise, you'll have, anytime you change a route, you have downtime, which I have experience with some other implementations I've tried. The second one's a lot more complicated because you have a lot of pieces. It's like, where are you actually reporting the status? And you run into some of the same issues around reporting readiness and how that's hard to do.
So the first part of that, you were just saying you should have some kind of health check or awareness and not send traffic until the new backend is ready. Is that correct?
So the first one is actually not necessarily about waiting or anything. It's like, I'll just explain how Istio implements it, and then hopefully it will make it more clear. Like we have these set of backends, right? And in this example, these 2 backends have been static for hours. And what they're doing is changing a route to point to backend A, then point to backend B, and back and forth, right? So basically, like the backend we're pointing to is just like an atomic pointer that's flipping between the 2. What shouldn't happen is like you tear everything down, and then you spin everything back up, and there's like downtime in between, right? It's like a graceful restart versus shut down and turn on. I don't know if I'm explaining this well. It's been that makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So this one, it feels like it needs someone to push it forward. I think the first one is more of we should provide a recommendation for what to do. It's not really like API change or anything like that. It's more of a recommendation. Number 2 feels a little bit different. But again, both of these don't really feel like they're API changes unless I'm missing something. Like they're more recommendations for implementations. Any suggestions on what to do next with this one?
Maybe see if we can define conformance tests and see, but I don't know what class they would be under, but and see which implementations abide by these, or yeah, 1 or 2.
Yeah, it's so hard to guarantee the same behavior on these kind of details, but that would be good if we could have consistent behavior, as reasonably consistent as possible. Any volunteers for someone just to follow up and complete the triage process on this, just to kind of get it to a point where we know the next steps?
Sure, but do we have an agreement on what those are? Or I can just follow up the questions that were discussed in the call on the.
Yeah, I think that's all we have right now. I don't know that we're complete, at least I don't think there's a complete consensus on next steps, but hopefully I think what we need here is just somebody to make sure that, you know, we're continuing this discussion, it doesn't get lost, and we have at least translated it into reasonable next steps.
Sounds
Cool.
good.
Thanks, Arco.
Yeah, appreciate that. It doesn't, you don't have to keep your name on it forever either. It's just until we can get it moving forward and we know where it belongs. We are out of time.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I will move on. We got through a pretty long list of those issues. Thank you to everyone for sticking it out. As always, we didn't make it to everything, so please take some time and run through these at your own pace. There's lots of open issues and PRs that could use review. For anyone at KubeCon next week, we would love to see you. Don't hesitate to reach out on Slack or anywhere. Yeah, and if you're not able to make it, we'll talk to everyone next 2 weeks from now. Have a good rest of your week. See you, everyone.